If you've been growing or changing lately, you may have noticed something interesting about relationships. When a person starts becoming more internally anchored, more themselves, the relationship around them begins to change. Sometimes people grow closer. Sometimes dynamics quietly begin to dissolve. And many people assume that means something went wrong in the relationship. But what's actually happening is that the structure of the relationship is reorganizing. Most people believe relationships are held together by things like compatibility, communication, chemistry, or emotional connection. And those things certainly influence how a relationship functions, but they're not what actually determines the structure of a relationship. What determines relationship structure is whether the people involved are negotiating their identity through each other or whether they're anchored within themselves. Many relationships are built around unconscious patterns, like seeking validation or using the other person to regulate emotions or reinforce identity roles. Sometimes one person becomes the stabilizer. Sometimes one assumes the role of the provider or the caretaker, or one becomes the giver of approval or reassurance. None of this is necessarily intentional. It's simply how many relationships organize themselves when people are still operating from old programming. But something begins to shift when a person becomes more internally anchored, when your sense of self is no longer dependent on how someone responds to you. Those unconscious roles start dissolving. You no longer need someone to confirm who you are. You no longer need the relationship to regulate your emotional state. And you no longer need the relationship to reinforce your identity. So when those patterns dissolve, the relationship can no longer organize around them. That is why some relationships begin to change during periods of personal growth. What once held the relationship together was likely a pattern that is just no longer operating. Which is also why, when only one person is moving through a period of inner expansion, we see dynamics shift as the relationship loses the structure that once held it together. Not because someone did something wrong, but because the outdated dynamic that previously organized the relationship is no longer active. When two people are no longer trying to regulate each other's identity, something very different becomes possible. Partnership stops being a place where we reinforce old versions of ourselves, and it becomes a place where we simply recognize each other clearly for who we really are. And that's exactly what this particular phase is all about. So if you're noticing relationship dynamics shifting around you, instead of assuming something is going wrong, you might simply pause and ask yourself, are certain patterns dissolving? Is something more honest, perhaps, trying to emerge between you? Because from that place, all of our relationships can reorganize into something more aligned with who we've become. Feel free to subscribe. I will continue exploring these patterns and what they reveal about how we relate to the people in our lives. I'm Katya, and I will see you in the next one.